This is by far one of the biggest screens I've ever presented in front of, which is pretty awesome. All right, let's get started. Welcome everybody to the first day. I'm excited to be here. We're going to be talking about today bounties and the effects that different actions have on the actual exploit economics and what's going on in the underground. We're going to cover kind of three different areas. First, I'm going to introduce for those of you who aren't used to working in this space, introduce the economy, what it looks like. We're going to examine the gray hat market and how they go about selling vulnerabilities and exploits. And then we're going to talk about how actions that are taken by vendors in the industry, how that affects what people are researching, and the types of bugs that are being discovered and sold in the white market and the gray market. So just to kind of give you an idea. But a quick introduction, my name is Brian Gorenc. I'm the Director of Vulnerability Research inside of Trend Micro. And my primary responsibility is running a program called the Zero Day Initiative. Now, how many of you heard of the Zero Day Initiative? All right, we're doing a pretty good job, actually. So we'll be talking about that program here in a second, because a lot of the data that we're going to be talking about is from that program. I also organize and run and adjudicate the ever-popular Pwn-to-Own hacking competition. Who's heard of that? Probably more people. Yeah, for some reason the program is not as popular as the actual contest, and I think that maybe because we offer more money at the contest. So I've been running that contest for about 7 years now, and so I've seen a lot of the effects of the different regulations that are coming on board, and we'll talk about those. I've spent a lot of time participating in the market as well. Let's do this. There we go. I worked on a team that was awarded one of the largest bounties ever from Microsoft at $125,000 for attacks against Internet Explorer's isolated heap and memory protection mitigations. I've done a lot of bug hunting in my past, so prior to working at ZDI and running ZDI, I actually submitted vulnerabilities to ZDI. So I've been in the marketplace for a long time, buying bugs and working here. So what you see on the screen here is the Zero Day Initiative program. And all of those blurry little lines over there, they're supposed to be CVEs. So over the 12-year history of this program, we've disclosed and purchased over 4,500 zero-day vulnerabilities. And we are what you would consider the world's largest vendor-agnostic bug bounty program. Now, what's different about that compared to other programs? We are not HackerOne, we're not BugCrowd. We are not paid by the vendors to buy the vulnerabilities for them. We don't run a bug bounty service. We are a bug bounty program for the purposes of intelligence gathering. We use this intelligence to feed the Trend Micro product line so that we can actually find the vulnerabilities being actively used in the wild and being able to filter and protect against the different exploit techniques that we are purchasing. So our business model is very different. We buy the best that's off the market. We don't have to buy everything. We just buy the best stuff. Right? And we don't typically focus on web vulnerabilities. We're focused mostly on client-side and server-side vulnerabilities, things that are going to be actively used in APT campaigns, and that gives us insight into what's actually going on in the underground and what is actually going to be used in those types of attacks. Now, let's talk about the exploit economy for a little bit and introduce it for those who are not used to it or have just started to get into it. As a researcher, and I was a researcher before coming to the ZDI, when you found a bug, you have a couple options that you can work in. The first one is the white hat space, and you can work and submit the bug to a bounty program, and they will work with, and those bounty programs will work with the vendor to fix the vulnerability. This is where ZDI lives. This is where HackerOne lives, BugCrowd, and all these different companies. This is where they all operate. We use it for intelligence purposes, for creating signatures. They use it for selling services. Now, the other option that's available is for people to go work and sell, and the researcher can take the vulnerability, write an exploit, and sell it to the gray market. And they can sell it to the government, through defense contractors, or they can work through a vulnerability broker. The thing is, with this market, you don't know where that exploit is going to be used, but it's going to be a higher price exploit because these companies and the governments that are purchasing these vulnerabilities really don't care about cost. If a missile being launched in a warfare situation costs $20 million, $100,000 for a single exploit is really not that much to these people. So you can actually make quite a bit of money in this space. Now, you can also work in the black market, where you sell your exploit to a exploit kit creator. This exploit kit is then sold to people who generate botnets, and then they rent out the botnets for use in their campaigns, either spamming or DDoS extortion or credential harvesting. Now, a smart criminal is going to buy a lot of these credentials and sell them to dumb criminals who are going to use them to buy beer and chips. And that's kind of the trickle-down economics for the exploit economy. Now, traditionally, dumb criminals are going to be caught because they're going to get arrested. Smart criminals or spammers are going to be caught because everybody hates spammers. Eventually, they're going to be captured. And smart criminals typically get caught. But everybody else does not get caught. Right, the people, selling the exploits, selling the kits, using the kits, and before they rent them out, they're traditionally not caught by law enforcement. Now, this economy is really active. Now, most of the people in this room who have been working in it for a little bit will know this, but what we can do is we can look at the incoming submission rates into the zero-day initiative to understand how active this economy is. So what you see here on the screen is the number of submissions coming into our program over the last 5 years. Right? And you can see the consistent growth of vulnerability submissions of vulnerability researchers working in this space, submitting bugs to bounty programs, going from less than 100 bugs in 2013 to over 1,000 bug submissions in a single quarter to actually coming through at least through our program. So that's an active marketplace for sure. Where are we buying all these vulnerabilities? We're buying them from all over the world. What you see on the screen here is all the blue countries are countries that we've purchased bugs in before. Now, some of these should be, since I made this, a couple more countries have come online, specifically Mexico. We've received a lot of vulnerabilities from a researcher in Mexico, and we're actively buying new stuff out of Africa. So we've actually recently bought a baseband exploit to compromise a cell phone without touching it out of Africa, and we've also bought several Office 0 days out of Africa as well. So that country is kind of coming online now as they mature in their research capabilities. Now let's look at this map and guess, where do you think we're buying vulnerabilities from for Microsoft products, Apple products, Oracle products, Google products? Where do you think we're buying all of those vulnerabilities from? Just yell it out. China, US, and Canada. This is where we're buying all of these vulnerabilities for. This makes sense. If you think about what they're actively using in campaigns, the researchers in those areas are looking for bugs in those products, and that's where we're getting most of our research from. Historically, with the United States and Canada, and China has come online a lot recently over the last several years. Now, where are we buying all of our critical infrastructure software vulnerabilities? Things like SCADA, the machines that are actually running the SCADA infrastructure, like the human-machine interface. Where are we buying all of those bugs from? Russia. We buy almost like probably 80% of the bugs coming through our program in SCADA applications are coming from Russia. A significant amount, which also makes sense if you think about how that government is supposedly using those in offensive campaigns. Now, these are in products like ABB, Advantech, Schneider Electric, Siemens, all of these different companies that are used across the world to run critical infrastructure. Most of the researchers are looking at it from Russia. Now, I always get to ask the question, like, why does the researchers not go to the gray market? And the gray market's got to be more lucrative. But we never, in our space, we could never really understand, other than just through conversations, I could never point to data that shows how lucrative the gray market is, our chief competitor. We're in the white market, we're trying to disrupt the gray market as much as possible. And we couldn't really do that until the hacking team breached. And when the hacking team breach came out, most of the industry, all of the InfoSec community was looking for the 0 days. They were digging through the databases, digging through the emails, looking for the 0 days so that they could get them fixed. And that makes sense. But we took a different approach in our group. We looked at the economics. What was this company doing? Who were they buying from? And were there any correlations or any collisions that we could have and we could demonstrate that we were making an impact in this space? Now, it was very lucrative business for them. They were selling a rat. They used zero-day vulnerabilities to break into networks, and they were selling this to governments. The top PO that you see on the screen is for a support contract from the Czech Republic for 90,000 euros per year for support. The one below that is a PO for a support contract for 180,000 euros per year for the service. Now, these aren't the only two countries buying this. Countries like Guatemala, Lebanon, Mongolia, Russia, Egypt, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brazil, Bangladesh, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Cyprus, UAE, and a small company out of Maryland, which there's other agencies in Maryland as well. So just different groups buying this type of service. So it is a very active marketplace on the gray side. Now, if we look at their business and how it was operating, we can see how well they were doing by looking at their profit and loss spreadsheets. So this is from a presentation of theirs. You can see that over 2015 to 2016, they were expected to grow 30%, which is significant for a company in this industry. They had 55 full-time employees, paying about $80,000 per. They were located in Italy, so that's about the going rate. And the interesting thing for us that we were really interested in was this other personnel cost. This is the cost for subcontractors typically in a company, and traditionally where you would go to buy the zero-day weapon that you're going to end up selling in your service. So how exactly do you buy a zero-day on the gray market, and how is it different than what we do buying zero days in the white market? Well, the first way to do it is through consultancy. And this is how we do it in the white hat market as well. A researcher will submit us their intellectual property, we'll verify that it exists, and we will purchase that off of them for a price, and we will treat them as an independent contractor in our system. This is the same way that the gray market does it. In this case, what you see is a invoice for a researcher to do consultancy services for this company for 40,000 euro. Now, what's interesting is the individual that they're talking to, Vitaly Toropov. Now, Vitaly Toropov, prior to the hacking team breach, wasn't very well known publicly for doing research, but he certainly was after the hacking team breach. Everybody talked about Vitaly Toropov and how great he was, and in fact, he is a great exploiter. But we had known about Vitaly Toropov for many years. He had been submitting to the ZDI program all sorts of vulnerabilities that we were end up fixing with the vendor. And he had about 100% success rate. Every single bug he submitted to our program, we purchased and got a patch for. He was also working over here at Hacking Team, and what's interesting thing about Vitaly and why this type of approach is important is because this individual was able to exploit software in ways that weren't publicly defined. So as an intelligence group trying to protect customers, the fact that we know how he is exploiting software makes it better for us from a protection perspective, because what he's doing is not what's publicly defined, right? Now, what's another way of doing this? Another option is to work with a vulnerability broker, right? And what they do is there's individuals out there who will work with researchers, and they will sell the researcher's product to a client, and they will charge a fee on top of that to sell the vulnerability. The idea keeping the researcher anonymous from the client, right? Now, one of the things that happened in this breach was the release of a broker's exploit inventory. So we can get an idea of how they're selling their bugs or their exploits. And what you see on the screen here is from a group called VBI, Vulnerability Brokerage International, and they were selling a Adobe Flash remote code execution exploit. And what's interesting is in this case, they actually act differently than the gray market, or than the white market. In this case, they are selling the asset in different ways. One is exclusive purchase, one is a non-exclusive purchase, and the other is a monthly license. Now, depending on what you're trying to do, they have different values. But the one that's most interesting to us is the exclusive purchase, where you're going to buy the vulnerability once, and it's going to be used in an operation that will, where you fire and forget. You basically shoot the bullet one time, you never use it again so that it's never caught, and that's why you buy an exclusive license. Very interesting and how that works. Now, that's going to garner the most price. So what does that mean? How much is that? Well, let's look at this. The cost of an exclusive license exploit is about $95,000 back when this was released. It's a little bit higher now. But they pay differently than we do too. In the white market, we pay 100% up front because our goal is to make sure the bug is killed as fast as possible, so we just pay 100% of the fee up front. In the gray market and vulnerability brokers, they're paying to ensure that the vulnerability maintains its zero-day status. So what they do is they pay on a schedule, 50% of the value after 30 days, 25% after another 30 days, and another 25% after another 30 days. Making sure that the researcher is not going to sell it through the broker and then immediately turn it around and sell it to ZDI, because we're going to kill the bug and they will no longer be useful. Now, I've talked to some brokers in Europe the last time I was there, and they said that since this leak, it's pretty much the same, except the time periods are a little bit longer now. Now, our goal in the white hat industry is to try to in our case, gather intelligence so we understand the attack surface and kill as many bugs as possible, but we also want to have an impact on the gray market. So how do we check whether we have an impact on the gray market or not? We do this by looking at the exploit list that they're selling. We want to buy bugs in products that they have exploits for so that we can affect the attack surface in a way that makes those exploits useless. So if we look at the inventory for VBI, we can look at the bugs that we're buying, and we can see we map pretty closely to this marketplace. So we have purchased vulnerabilities in all of those products with the red arrows next to them. Now, why is this important? We understand that we are able to affect, we're buying in the right products, we know how they're selling, we know how all this works, but the reality is we're living in a shadow broker's world, right? Last year, with the release of the equation group exploits from shadow brokers, we all saw what happened. All of these governments and all of these groups have very advanced cyber weapons capabilities, and we saw those actively used in the wild in the previous year. So how do we know we are making an impact there? Like, what we really want to see is a collision, what we call a collision in our industry, where we're buying a vulnerability that's actively being used in a government-grade exploit, and forcing the government to actually change the way that they're operating. And we do have evidence of this. When the equation group's information was released, which is supposedly the NSA's tailored access group, they released an exploit toolkit. We all know this in this industry now. And one of those was Eternal Blue, which ended up being turned into WannaCry, which ended up causing a lot of ransomware infections. Another exploit in that group was called Ewok Frenzy. Ewok Frenzy was an exploit for IBM's Lotus Domino, which is a mail server that is a competitor to Exchange and is often used by people who don't want to pay for Exchange because of whatever reason. They think Domino is more secure, or it's used a lot in the defense industry, which makes it an interesting target for the people supposedly using these exploits. Now, this vulnerability was a CVSS-10, which is the most critical vulnerability that you can have. It's a remote system, remote root without authentication exploit. And we actually purchased that vulnerability back in 2006. We purchased that vulnerability, we supplied it to IBM, and they fixed it as a denial of service condition. We released the advisory as a remote code execution vulnerability, and the NSA agreed that it was also a remote code execution vulnerability because they have an exploit for it in their tool chest. So just a very interesting collision back in 2006, and that's how old that group, that exploit kit was. Very, very old, and with really solid exploits. I actually analyzed that exploit by myself, and it was very, very clean. Did exactly what it needed to do. Now, is there another case where we have a collision? Now, we have collisions we know from the NSA side of the house, but we also have a very interesting collision that most people don't know about that we'll talk about right now. If we remember the Stuxnet exploit, it was one of the first cyber weapons to come out, and it was attributed to the United States and Israel, breaking into the Iranian power plants and breaking the projector. The idea, but the way that the exploit worked is you had to jump an air gap, right? So we had to jump an air gap. It wasn't connected directly to the network. And so to do that, they used a vulnerability in the link processing for Windows where you basically plug in a USB, a folder pops up, and code execution occurs, right? So when the code execution occurs, they're able to install their malware. There's no user interaction. It makes this real simple, and then they launch their payload, breaks the PLCs, destroys the centrifuges. Hooray for everybody. So that bug was patched in 2010, and the entire industry was looking at that code base because it was the most interesting cyber weapon that had come out at the time. I mean, everybody. Every company was looking at the code. Every company was looking at the patch. Every company was analyzing the malware and trying to understand exactly how it worked. How is it possible? And then you think, like, that bug is done. We patched it in 2010. It no longer exists anymore. And then all of a sudden, in 2015, we received a submission from a researcher named Michael Heerklotz. Supposedly was a bypass to that patch, re-enabling that vector for use. And we saw this, and we were like, this is not possible, right? And everybody in the industry was looking at this code. How is it possible that this computer science student who found the bug supposedly after reading Countdown to Zero Day, which is a book about Stuxnet, he would go in there and send to us a full white paper and full exploit for a bypass re-enabling this vector. And we analyzed the case, and we said, oh, this actually works. This is amazing. Here's what it looks like. You just view the folder, and bam, code execution. That's all you do. It's also exploitable from a network share. If you have an SMB share, all you have to do is browse the folder, and it's game over. There was one way to bypass that patch, and only one way that this individual had found, and we were like, this is awesome. We bought the bug. We submitted to Microsoft, and we said, Microsoft, you should, like, we weren't at Trend Micro at the time, but you should turn on your silent signatures because this is really strange, right? We don't normally get full white papers from computer science students. So usually it's a proof of concept or like some sort of, here's the code that's bad. So we submit that, goes to Microsoft, they release the patch, and we never hear from it again. Until Vault 7 happened. We started looking at the Vault 7 paperwork, which is supposedly a leak from the CIA's exploit kits or exploit tool chains, and we noticed that they had a closed network infiltration tool available for use called Easy Cheese. Easy Cheese, after reading the documentation, was leveraging CVE 2015-0096 as the initial vector for exploitation of closed or air-gap networks. Really interesting to see. In two cases now, we have white hat programs affecting the way that cyber operations and government-grade exploits are working. Like I said, again, we had hits in the wild on this, and so it's a very interesting bug chain for us. We've also have evidence of disrupting possible Russian malware campaigns and also Chinese campaigns through our program. If you dig deep into affidavit paperwork for people who have recently been arrested, you can kind of understand what bugs they're using and who's actually killing those bugs as part of the economy. Now, let's talk about market factors and trends for a second. So now we know we can gather intelligence, we have an effect on the marketplace, we are able to change the way the governments are operating, but can we affect what happens to the marketplace when various actions occur from the vendors? And we can do that by looking at the submission rates for various bug classes throughout the program. So what you see here is the submission rate for Oracle Java vulnerabilities coming through our program. And traditionally, we have 0 to 5 Java 0 days coming through our program per quarter. But all of a sudden, we saw this huge spike in the fourth quarter of 2013 or 2012. Now, this spike corresponds to active exploitation of Java sandbox escapes in the wild. And we can have researchers who are looking at those exploits, converting them and trying to find variants of these and trying to kill the bugs and submitting them to our program. So whenever we see a spike, we feel that these bugs are going to be actively exploited. Now, what happened in the second quarter of 2012? And why did those drop off? Well, the reason is the browser manufacturers started to implement click-to-play mitigations, forcing people to click on Java applets to run them. And as a result, it was no longer a view and compromise type of situation. And as a result, those bugs are less interesting for people to look at. And so away the researchers went. Now, where's another case where we have a marketplace affecting, or a trend that affects the marketplace? Well, it also happens when new mitigations come out. So this on the screen is the submission rate for Internet Explorer 0-day vulnerabilities into our program over the last 5 years. And you can see, again, a huge spike in the second quarter of 2014. I mean, we're talking a new 0-day every single day coming into our program. This also corresponds to the active exploitation of use after free vulnerabilities in the wild. You can see this time the researchers were before the active exploitation, and that when the exploitation started to occur, they tuned their fuzzers and they got better and better and better and started submitting more and more bugs into the program, which would then eventually go to Microsoft. Now, what happened after the second quarter of 2014? Well, at this point, Microsoft released silently a new mitigation in the browser that most people don't know about called isolated heap and memory protection. The whole point of this mitigation was to make the use after free ineffective, turning what was exploitable use after frees into null pointer dereferences, which are not exploitable. which are not exploitable. And this release of this mitigation had a significant effect on the marketplace. Immediately, we saw a decrease in the number of submissions in Internet Explorer O days into our program, and most of those submissions ended up being not exploitable. So we should also thank Microsoft for the release of that mitigation, because it really affected the way that the underground and people were looking at that piece of code. Now, you see a significant drop-off in Internet Explorer submissions at the end of 2017, and that's because Edge had come out, and now people were targeting Edge. But now what do you see? You see a little bit of a spike happening in Edge and Internet Explorer submissions, which likely means that there is a new vector found that people are abusing and finding, and we know exactly what that is, which we'll talk about later. Now, what happens when an end-of-life announcement occurs for a product? You can see here, these are the submission rates for Adobe Flash vulnerabilities coming into our program. Again, we only really had 1 to 5 every quarter, but then in the middle of 2015, we saw a significant uptick in Adobe Flash, corresponding again to the exploitation of Adobe Flash by exploit kits, and they had moved from Oracle to Internet Explorer to Flash. And then you see in the second quarter of 2017 a significant drop in this. Now, this drop is because the release, or Adobe basically says, we're going to end of life Flash, and as a result, all of the submissions basically stopped. People moved on to other things because they're no longer interesting. There are no longer ways to do a complete compromise just by viewing a Flash application. Now, what happens when things go unchecked? So this is our latest spike in the program. What we're looking at is the submission rate of Adobe, or basically PDF reader application 0 days coming into our program, a combination of Adobe, Foxit, and Microsoft Reader. And you can see that researchers have moved on and are looking at new areas now, right? But there has been no industry check yet for these submissions to drop, and as a result, we believe that eventually these will actively be used in the wild. Traditionally, the Adobe Reader vulnerabilities are things related to JavaScript inside of the Adobe Reader or Foxit Reader, and also vulnerabilities related to image parsing. So kind of classic, exploits and vulnerabilities in these areas. Now let's lay all of this on top of each other, and you can see that on average we're receiving anywhere from 50 to 100 bugs per quarter in these various products, and you can actually see the rise and fall of the vulnerability classes based off of what the vendors are doing. You see the rise of Java sandbox escapes and vulnerabilities coming into the program. You see the industry check that by introducing click to play, and you see those drop. Then researchers will convert over into browser-based vulnerabilities, use after freeze, because they're really easy to find, and there was a bunch of them at the time. I mean, every time we received a new Internet Explorer vulnerability into our program, they were almost automatically exploitable. They would basically lead straight to RCE, and they were really, really deadly. You then see the vendor release a mitigation, and those kind of die off. Then you see researchers move over into Flash vulnerabilities, and you see the release of a new mitigation, or basically the killing of the product completely. And then, as a result, the Flash vulnerabilities disappear. Then you see, in our case, another spike. So something is strange going on in this vulnerability research space right now. You're seeing a spike in PDF reader vulnerabilities, mostly because those are installed everywhere, and that you can exploit most of these bugs pretty easy. But also you're seeing a spike in browser vulnerabilities again. And this is not just on Microsoft Edge and Internet Explorer, it's also on things like Apple Safari and the other browsers. And if you look at our contest, the individuals who are coming to our contest are exploiting the bugs that we are seeing come through the programs. Things like issues related to bounds checking and type confusion in JavaScript optimization, issues in the way that JavaScript arrays are implemented in the browser, and also they are starting to find areas and edge cases where the mitigation that was released several years ago is not effective. Interior pointers and all this other stuff that allows for you to enable some of the use after freeze to become exploitable again. So it's just interesting to see the ups and downs and the ebbs and flows of the marketplace. The next thing that's really interesting for us is regulations. Typically, we don't talk about regulations all that much, but it does have an effect on what's actually going on. So back in December 2013, there was the release of the Wassenaar Arrangement, which classified cyber weapons or exploits as cyber weapons or dual-use technology. And when it was classified as dual-use technology, the whole industry went up in arms. And everybody was really upset that all of a sudden exploits could not be trafficked around without some sort of check from a government. Now, the purpose of the actual regulations is important. The whole idea is to prevent Western technology from being used and sold to countries and governments that are going to abuse human rights. That's kind of the reason that this regulation exists, and that makes sense. But the way that it was written was extremely vague. And the way that it was written, it would impact most people doing research in the industry, and would also impact penetration testing companies who are trying to sell their products, and it would affect people in my industry who are trafficking exploits and trying to get them fixed. And you can look, and there's no real way to look and show the impact other than looking at the Pwn-to-Own contest. So the Pwn-to-Own contest, we bring researchers out from around the world and we put bounties, six-figure bounties on exploits against zero-day vulnerabilities and against the newest mitigations in things like Chrome and Edge and virtualization software and enterprise applications. And back in 2012, prior to the release of the Wassenaar Arrangement, we had people from all over the world coming into this program and submitting bugs to us. When the Wassenaar Arrangement came out, you saw the Europeans and the people who had the Wassenaar Arrangement in their country go away. And as a result, those exploits and the work that they were working on likely did not get fixed by the vendors, which is the counter effect of what we're trying to do with the regulations. So it doesn't make any sense the way that it was written. And it's not so much that they were afraid of being caught, because these guys and gals who are writing these exploits and selling them to governments or coming to our contest or whatnot understand how to do it, right? What ends up happening is there's a misunderstanding of the way that the regulation is implemented, and it took them several years to actually figure it out. And now they understand how to export the exploit, and so they bring them to the contest now. So it took them 2 years to adjust to this regulation and actually start bringing exploits again to the contest. And you saw this year a lot of Europeans come into the contest, and all of those exploits had to go through an export control on the way out. So somewhere in some paper in some government, I have a signature somewhere that says, I received a cyber weapon from this individual over who had come into the contest. But it took some time for us to figure that out, right? And that is the issue with the regulations, is that people don't understand how they actually work them, because most of these people, in this room and the people trafficking exploits don't have lawyers. But the people who actually are selling to governments do have lawyers, and they know how to work the system, and they know how to actually make it happen. All it's really affecting is the white hat industry, which kind of stinks. Now, there's another set of regulations that have come out that most people don't know about, but I'm intimately aware of, which is the Chinese regulations. So how many people know China regulators? Yes, in the back? All right. So recently, the Chinese government decided that they were going to remove Chinese researchers from all capture the flag competitions and competitions like Pwn-to-Own, effectively keeping the researchers at home. Now, we're kind of in the same position again that we were with the Wassenaar when we really didn't understand how it was going to work. When the new regulations came out, you saw all the Chinese researchers get scared and not wanting to participate, and as a result, in March of 2018, we had 0 Chinese researchers at the contest. Now, the whole point of the contest is to kill bugs and harden mitigations, and we can't do that without people actually participating in the contest, because most of the time these people aren't going to do this for free. They want money, they want fame, that's what this is all about. And so if they're afraid to actually come out and participate in the contest, everybody in this room as a whole is less secure, because the vulnerabilities and exploits actually is possible. And we can actually understand how they're working when we can actually get access to them. And the fame and the marketing behind some of these contests is the reason that these teams exist. And now there's kind of this misunderstanding of exactly how this is all going to go down. And we're in very, very early stages of understanding the Chinese regulations, and we'll see what happens over the next year. In the end, we're trying to kill bugs, and so we're going to offer the bounties no matter what. It's just who's going to come out. You can kind of tell how these regulations actually affect the underground and affect the industry by looking at contests like mine, looking at DEF CONs, CTF, et cetera. So it's kind of just interesting to see how that shakes out when it's not vendors actually making the implementation changes to make things harder. Now, in conclusion, most of us who work in the bounty space, we have a set of goals that we're trying to reach. We want to harden the attack surface of critical software, whether it's companies that were actively paying you to run the bounty program, or companies like, or groups like mine that are paying for the intelligence to harden the attack surface. But we want to focus our purchasing on the important things that everybody relies on: operating systems, browsers, infrastructure software, SCADA software. We have a particular interest in infrastructure software, things that are servers, because in reality, that's what the governments are going to want to compromise. The governments aren't going to compromise, client-side vulnerabilities all that much. What they're going to go after is infrastructure software like routers, so they can sit there in the router, they can watch everything going on, and as a result, those vulnerabilities are extremely valuable for us to purchase. We want to disrupt exploits that are being used in active attacks. We can tell now from some of the leaks that we are actively having an effect, and the money that's being spent on vulnerabilities is actually disrupting the way that operations are working, which is, I think, to be very, very valuable, especially now that we can't really secure the weapons that we're actively using. We also want to educate regulators and legislators who are trying to regulate the industry for good purposes, but don't understand how the industry actually works, in a way to allow them to regulate it so that free trade of exploits can happen in a way that secures the ecosystem. And with that, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. If you have questions, I'll be around.